Madeline Harper sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight spilling weakly through the blinds, casting stripes across the cold countertop. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, the bitter taste matching the emptiness she felt inside. Derek was already gone, his briefcase in hand, leaving a quick kiss on her cheek that felt more like a formality than affection. The sound of the front door closing echoed in the silent house, leaving her alone once again with her thoughts that had been circling the same void for 10 years. Ethan, her 16-year-old son, came bounding down the stairs with the energy of youth and the obliviousness of someone untouched by the weight of emotional starvation. "Morning, Mom," he called cheerfully, grabbing a granola bar from the counter. His smile was bright, but Madeline noticed the shadow in his eyes, the echo of long nights spent quiet while Derek worked late, the world of children forced to grow up around parental neglect. Lucas Bennett, Ethan's best friend, had been at the house almost as long as Ethan had. He was 17, tall, with a confident ease that made people listen when he spoke. From the very beginning, he had been attentive, polite, and unusually perceptive. Today, he lingered by the doorway, a casual observer who somehow always seemed to notice the smallest things, the way Madeline's shoulders slumped, the subtle tension in her hands as she poured coffee, the silence that filled the space Derek's absence left behind. "Hey, Lucas," she said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She wasn't sure why she smiled at him, it wasn't entirely appropriate, not with him being Ethan's friend. But it was involuntary, a reflex of someone starved for recognition, for care, for attention that had been missing for a decade. Lucas stepped closer, carrying a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Morning, Mrs. Harper. You look tired," he said gently, his eyes meeting hers. There was no judgment in his tone, only observation, and somehow it stung because it was the first time in years someone had truly seen her. Madeline nodded, unsure if she should respond. "Just, long night," she murmured, stirring her coffee again. Her hand shook slightly, betraying the tight knot of anxiety that had become a constant companion. She wondered if anyone else could see the invisible weight she carried daily, the emptiness that stretched across 10 years like a canyon no one dared cross. Ethan, oblivious as usual, plopped down across from her, chattering about a school project. Madeline smiled faintly at his excitement, though it only deepened the ache in her chest. Derek had never shown interest in these moments, always too busy with work, meetings, or phone calls that could wait but never did. She was alone with her husband even when he was physically present. Lucas, sensing her retreating gaze, pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Need some help with that?" he asked, nodding toward the stack of bills she had been pretending not to notice. There was a subtle kindness in his question, one that stirred something unfamiliar in Madeline, a flicker of warmth, a temptation she immediately scolded herself for feeling. "I'll manage," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. She was tempted to accept his offer, to feel that someone cared enough to step in. Something about Lucas made the walls she had built around herself feel less necessary, as if for a brief moment, she could let down the decades of careful restraint. The morning passed in a blur of small domestic routines, Ethan finishing his breakfast, Lucas helping him organize his backpack for school, and Madeline moving between the kitchen and living room, doing chores with a mechanical rhythm. Yet, Lucas stayed near her, occasionally making a light-hearted comment or asking if she needed a hand. It wasn't inappropriate, but it carried an intimacy she hadn't felt in years. Later, when Ethan and Lucas headed out for a bike ride, Madeline found herself lingering at the window, watching them go. Her stomach twisted with a strange combination of envy and longing, emotions she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge in over a decade. She realized that she craved attention, understanding, and affection, not from a stranger, not even consciously from Lucas, but simply from someone who saw her, truly saw her. It was then that a small accident occurred. A vase tipped over as she reached for a stack of mail, shattering on the tile floor. The sound was sharp, echoing in the empty house. Madeline froze, a rush of frustration and embarrassment flooding her chest. She felt herself falter, her knees weak from a sudden wave of helplessness. Lucas had turned back just in time to see her flinch. Without hesitation, he crossed the distance to her and crouched beside the broken vase. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his hand brushing hers as he helped gather the pieces. His touch was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent an unexpected jolt through her. Madeline looked at him, her chest tight. "Thank you," she whispered, the words heavier than she expected. For a moment, the world narrowed down to this small, human connection, a flicker of warmth in the cold emptiness that had defined her life for the past 10 years. Lucas smiled softly. "Don't mention it," he said, and for the first time in a long while, Madeline felt a sliver of relief, of being seen, of being important, if only for a brief moment. As the afternoon light shifted, Madeline moved to the living room, sitting in silence and reflecting on the day. Her heart was stirring, a strange mixture of guilt, longing, and something dangerous she couldn't yet name. The line between comfort and desire blurred in ways she had never expected, and she couldn't help but wonder if Lucas noticed too, or if it was simply her own fragile mind conjuring what she had been starved of for so long. When Derek returned that evening, he barely glanced at her. His brief, distracted greeting was all that filled the room before he disappeared into the study. Madeline exhaled slowly, tension coiling in her chest. She realized that in Lucas' small, thoughtful gestures, she had found a taste of something she hadn't felt in 10 years, and as she washed the dishes that night, her mind lingered on his smile, the way he had seemed to understand her without needing her to explain a single word. She didn't admit it aloud, couldn't, but a part of her was already longing for the next encounter, the next chance to feel recognized, to feel alive again.
The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet companionship. Adrian and I grew inseparable, our doors swinging open as though hinges no longer mattered. Meals were shared, study notes exchanged, and the silence of midnight hours filled with conversations that left us more entangled than either of us dared to admit. The hostel had hundreds of boys, yet it often felt like Adrian and I lived in a world apart, divided from the rest by invisible walls, but beneath the comfort of routine, unease grew. I caught myself watching him too long, memorizing the curve of his smile or the sound of his laughter. Each glance carried a weight I could no longer deny. And though I told myself to step back, to reclaim the distance we had so easily discarded, I found it impossible. Adrian had become a gravitational pull, and I was helplessly caught in his orbit. The conflict within me sharpened whenever Michael's name appeared. Adrian would occasionally mention him, never with enthusiasm, never with the warmth I expected from someone speaking of love. Once, when his phone rang during dinner, I noticed the name glowing on his screen. He silenced it, muttering something about bad timing, and continued eating as though nothing had happened. I said nothing, but my chest tightened with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Why was he ignoring the man he claimed to love? One evening, we lingered in my room long after most lights in the hostel had gone dark. Our books lay forgotten on the desk, and we sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking in low tones. Adrian confessed that he often felt misunderstood, that Michael expected things from him he could not always give. His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to see. I wanted to comfort him, to say something meaningful, but all I managed was silence. In that silence, I realized my role was shifting. I was no longer just his friend. I was becoming his confidant, the one who knew the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. Guilt gnawed at me. I should have set boundaries, should have reminded him of the man waiting for him elsewhere. Yet the truth was crueler. I didn't want to. I wanted to be the one he turned to, the one who filled the void Michael seemed unable to reach. Each word he spoke deepened my longing and eroded my resolve. The night of confession came quietly, almost tenderly. We had been arguing over something trivial, whether he should reconcile with Michael or demand more honesty from him. I had spoken with unusual sharpness, frustration boiling over, not at Michael but at the invisible tether that bound Adrian away from me. He fell silent, staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. And then, without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips against mine. The kiss was brief but electric, shattering the fragile wall I had clung to for weeks. When he pulled away, the air between us seemed charged, the silence deafening. My heart pounded as I searched his face for regret, but all I saw was confusion, confusion that mirrored my own. We sat there, eyes locked, caught between desire and dread. Neither of us spoke of it the next day. Yet the current between us had shifted irreversibly. Every word, every gesture carried the echo of that moment. And though we tried to pretend otherwise, the truth hovered like a storm cloud. We had crossed a line. That night, Adrian returned to my room. There were no excuses this time, no pretense of study or conversation. He closed the door softly behind him, and in the quiet that followed, we gave in to what we had both been resisting. The weight of secrecy pressed down on me even as I felt the exhilaration of closeness I had long imagined. It was everything I had wanted, and everything I feared. When dawn broke, the world outside continued as though nothing had changed. Boys shouted in the corridor, breakfast smells drifted from the mess hall, and life resumed its predictable rhythm. But for me, nothing was the same. I lay awake long after Adrian slipped back into his own room, replaying every detail, every breath. The thrill was intoxicating, but beneath it lurked a shadow I could not ignore, that we had betrayed someone who trusted him, someone who deserved honesty. I had stepped willingly into the role of the intruder, the secret. The thought should have filled me with shame, but instead, it left me torn, between guilt and the dangerous sweetness of having what I had silently desired, and as I stared at the ceiling, I knew with painful clarity, the path ahead would not be simple. What had begun with a knock on the door had become something neither of us could control. The next few days felt like walking across a bridge made of glass, every step fragile, every glance uncertain. Whenever Michael's name appeared on my phone, my pulse quickened, not out of fear anymore, but something I dared not name. I kept telling myself to block him, to erase the evidence and forget the whole incident, yet the thought of severing the connection felt impossible. Michael didn't rush. He didn't demand. Instead, his messages came with a measured calm, like drops of water falling on stone, shaping me slowly. "How are you holding up?" one night. "You don't have to be embarrassed," another. His words weren't overtly scandalous, but they hinted at knowledge, at understanding, at something he was offering that no one else knew I wanted. When I finally agreed to meet him, it wasn't planned. My father asked me to deliver some old documents to Michael's office, a small law practice on the other side of town. I considered refusing, but that would raise questions I couldn't answer. So, I went, papers in hand, dread tangled with anticipation. Michael welcomed me with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide. His office smelled faintly of leather and cologne, and the blinds let in thin strips of afternoon sunlight that cut across the room. He gestured for me to sit, and for a moment, everything felt painfully ordinary. Then he closed the door. "Ethan," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of our unspoken secret. "About the other night, you don't need to worry. I haven't said anything to your father, and I won't." Relief flooded through me, but it was tangled with unease. "Thank you," I muttered, unsure what else to say. He leaned back, studying me with eyes that felt too perceptive. "You're not a child anymore. You're finding yourself." That picture, it wasn't just an accident. It told me more than words could. I froze. My instinct was to deny, to insist it meant nothing, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. Michael wasn't wrong. The photo had been meant for someone else, but it also revealed the part of me I kept buried. "I don't want things to be weird between us," I managed to say, though my voice betrayed my nerves. Michael smiled faintly, not mocking, but knowing. "It doesn't have to be. Secrets don't always have to destroy, Ethan. Sometimes they connect." That sentence lingered in my mind long after I left his office. It was dangerous, intoxicating. A bond built on secrecy was both fragile and irresistible. Our conversations deepened after that. Late-night texts stretched into hours, filled with subtle compliments and gentle provocations. He never pushed too far, but he always left me leaning over the edge, wondering what it would feel like to let go completely. I told myself it was harmless, that nothing had actually happened, but each word blurred the line further. The tension reached its peak one evening when my father invited Michael over for dinner. The three of us sat at the table, laughter and stories filling the air as though nothing were amiss. Yet beneath the surface, a different conversation unfolded in silence. Michael's eyes met mine across the table, brief glances that carried more weight than any sentence. I tried to focus on my food, on my father's anecdotes, but my thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in a dangerous game of hidden looks and unspoken meaning. After dinner, while my father cleared the plates, Michael lingered near the hallway. As I passed by, he leaned in close enough that only I could hear. "You know you want this too," he whispered, his voice steady, his breath warm against my ear. My body froze, but I didn't move away. I didn't agree, but I didn't reject him either. The silence that followed was louder than any response I could have given. That night, I lay awake again, my thoughts a storm. I hated the secrecy, hated the guilt, yet I couldn't deny the pull. Michael had awakened something I hadn't been ready to face, and the more I resisted, the more consuming it became. By the end of that week, I knew two things for certain: I couldn't confess this to my father, and I couldn't ignore Michael any longer. The path ahead wasn't just uncertain, it was dangerous. And yet, every step I took seemed to draw me closer to him, closer to the betrayal I feared but